And we're looking good, you'll be in for a fight, and we fight pretty good. Getting goals is our job, and we get goals good. Looking good, we are Carlisle United.
Carlisle United, the team that's on the ball. Carlisle United, the team for one and all. You're looking good, and we're with you all the way. You'll hear us singing every time you play.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Brunton Bugle, a podcast focusing on the trials and tribulations of Carlisle United Football Club. From Frank Barton to Jared Branthwaite and Derek Asamoah to Warren Aspinall, we've got it covered. Today we're bringing you one of our special episodes and I'm sure it's going to be a belter. We're going to be speaking to Jon Colman, the Carlisle United reporter for the News and Star and Cumberland News, who has a new book out, Bolts from the Blues, telling the story of 40 different Carlisle United goals from 1960s to present day. Jon, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to read out actually the blurb from the back because I think that gives you a better idea of what the book's about than my little bit there. So from the back of the book it says here, from the 1960s to the present day, the men behind some of Carlisle United's most memorable moments relive the days and nights that made their mark and open up on their Brunton Park careers. This book celebrates promotion heroes, cup winners, giant killers, relegation saviours, history makers and scorers of the strange, stunning and spectacular. From Murray to Murphy, Halpin to Hawley, Rafferty to Reeves, Wake to Winstanley, Poskett to Pericard, Bridges to Branthwaite and Granger to Glass. These are goals that inspired the Carlisle United team supporters, told by the stars who scored them. Jon, thank you for joining me. Really do appreciate taking your time out to talk about the book. Yeah, you've written two biographies previous to this, Jon, but why did you choose this as your topic for your latest book?
Well, thanks for having me on, Lee. Really appreciate it. It was, I don't think it was a book I was particularly planning to write at the start of the year, and certainly going into March, it wasn't really something that was in the front of my mind. You know, as a journalist and someone that's helped write a couple of books, you always have other ideas in your mind, and I had various ideas rattling around my head about books of different sorts, whether I'd do a bit more ghostwriting or whether I'd do something Carlisle United specific, but nothing that I was really working on. I thought I would just have a bit of a breather after doing Matt Jansen's because it does take over your life a bit. But when COVID-19 really came to that peak in March, when football ground to a halt, and then I was furloughed for a while, the whole idea arose from that. It was a time when our Saturdays as football supporters and mine as a reporter had suddenly ground to a halt. Quite an unsettling time, I think, for a lot of people. It was just that Saturday ritual and those routines and everything had just been put on the shelf, and in that void came a lot of nostalgia. Certainly here in the Carlisle United world, we had Radio Cumbria producing classic commentaries, which I was listening to. The club were uploading classic games, footage of those, great goals were coming on their Twitter account and things. And I just think the Carlisle supporters in general were talking about and discussing favourite memories, favourite games, goals, all that sort of thing was really filling the void. So it was, the whole idea was inspired by that sense of looking back into what was special, I think, for Carlisle supporters, what memories, what moments really resonated with them above the norm, and the idea just came really from that as something that I thought was maybe achievable in the lockdown. It wasn't something I would have to go up and down the country talking to people and meeting people, going into places to do heaps of research, which you physically couldn't do while you're confined to your homes. So the idea all came from the lockdown, so it was an idea very much of its time. So it was done in quick time as well, and I'm just pleased how it turned out in the end.
Yeah, so obviously you got a bit that time in lockdown to think about the idea for the book, and then once you've come up with the idea, right, I'm going to do it about goals. How did the process then begin if you think to yourself, right, I need to get this down to 40 goals, and clearly you wanted it to be, you couldn't, from what I can see, no player has more than one goal in there, do they? So you've basically gone through and said, right, I'm going to pick 40 goals. How do you start that process of whittling it down to the ones you want?
Yeah, very, very hard. I mean, I think the idea started quite vaguely as maybe I could do maybe 20, or then I realised that was never going to be enough because you're just missing out some really iconic goals. Then I crept up to 30, and as I went along, I found that I was really pleased that the vast majority of the players who I was approaching and putting this idea to were all responding really quickly and really enthusiastically. I think a lot of them were really engaged by the charity side of the book as well. And I was finding it quite easy to get to these guys and get what I was wanting out of them, which was a bit of their time, some real insights into the memories, things I could really work and weave into a book. So it got to 30, and then I was talking to the publisher, Vertical Editions, as well, about what this book would look like, how it would take shape, the sort of length of it. And I just think I got up to 40 without too much difficulty, and thought, well, that's in terms of length, in terms of what's achievable and doable, and making sure I pin all these stories down, all these guys down, then it was a good number to round it off. I mean, it was never the intention that this would be like a top 30 or top 40 or a chart, me imposing the idea that these are the best goals or these are the most important or brilliant or whatever. It was, I really just wanted to talk to players, get some good stories and write about them, really, and just relive a little bit of that magic. So that's how it came together, but it was whittling it down was hard in a lot of ways.
Yeah, obviously you mentioned the fact that it's not 40 best goals. That's one thing that's very clear in this, isn't it? It's 40, I suppose, interesting goals, aren't there? Some great goals in there, but there's also some goals that, for instance, Hallam Hope's goal, you maybe wouldn't argue is the best goal, but it's an interesting one. You don't see that very often at all, for example. And even some of the goals, I mean, Brian Wake's goal against Shrewsbury is not the greatest goal you'll ever see, but you know what? It's an iconic goal and people remember it. So yeah. So was it always in your head, you're thinking the majority of the focus is going to be on when you've been a fan and when your career as a reporter has been, but do you have in your mind thinking I need to get a decent number as well in prior to that time too?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to span as much, of the club's history as I reasonably could, while being conscious that, there's so far back that it wouldn't have been possible to go, whilst getting the perspectives of the players concerned. If it had been the top 40 most important goals, for example, you start at the very beginning with Jim Connell back in 28, and then you work forward through a lot of the legends of that time, and even some of more recent times that are no longer with us that I had to sort of sadly rule out because I was keen to get the perspective of the players. So I was really pleased that I was able to begin it with Hughie Mack in '63 against Gateshead, because I've heard a number of people talk very wistfully about this game and about this phenomenal legendary figure in the club's history. And I'm really envious of the people who got to watch him in his prime. And I spoke to Ross Brewster about that day against Gateshead, and I just felt that Hughie was a great person, a great figure to start it off with. I mean, it's all very subjective about the choices and everything, but I was keen to, because that period in the '60s was really the start of Carlisle's real rise into sort of serious prominence in football. The promotions up to the second division, and then that long stint at that level, then up to the first division. That journey was really on by then. So it would have been totally wrong to have not given due respect to that period. And that's why Tommy Murray at Newcastle, that really famous FA Cup victory, Carlisle in a League Cup semi-final, which is almost absurd to think of now, but there it was in '69 with Frank Barton, and there were some obvious ones, and I was thrilled that I was able to get to speak to these people like Topwin Stanley about Roma and Les O'Neill in the first division. You couldn't really produce a book on iconic Carlisle goals without giving sort of due respect to, really, I think you have to say, the greatest period, greatest chunk of years in the club's history. So I was glad I was able to do that, and I know there'll be many others that I haven't included, and some through necessity, some through choice. But I hope I've spanned enough of that period, whilst also, as you say, really devoting a lot of the stuff to my time as a fan and as a reporter over the last 30 years or so, because that's where the passion comes from in the writing. I think when it's from your own time. So try to get a bit of a blend, and I know you can never satisfy everyone. Everyone has the favourites, but I hope I've covered enough of that stretch in the round.
Do you feel that, compared to other clubs, that Carlisle United sort of club history and the way it's covered, there's sort of gaps there sometimes of stuff that gets a bit of focus. For instance, speaking of someone who started following the 1990s, I never really knew a huge amount about the club in the 80s. It's only maybe in the last few years I've started to gather that we were a pretty decent side. And I've seen obviously on the Big Match Revisited, for example, when they've showed the clips of them playing at Man City, when I think that was it 3-1 they won that day, famously, and things like that. Do you think that's something that basically maybe needs to be gaps filled going forward for fans? Because, like I said, for a lot of younger fans won't know that actually people always talk about obviously the mid 70s and the mid 90s, but actually the mid 80s as well was the last time we were in Championship level.
Well, absolutely, and not just at that level, but certainly in 83, 84, having a real good go back up to the First Division, which would have been one heck of an achievement. And I think you're right in the point you make, and I mean, I think really it's probably the fault of people like me whose job it is to write about the club and chronicle it, that we maybe don't give as much attention to that period as perhaps we should. It's something I touched on when I wrote about Pop Robson's goal.
Yeah, that's what I noticed. Yeah,
that got the promotion back to that level. The last time Carlisle ever went up to that level of football, which should be held in high regard, and it is. I think the 80s is quite a fascinating period in Carlisle United's history, because like you, my support started right at the back end of that decade and really sort of developed for me in the early 90s. But the 80s was an interesting decade because it was that peak of getting to that second division and with what by all accounts was a heck of a team with some fantastic players, Mally Poskett and other guys I spoke to, a real icon of that period. There were one or two other goals that I looked at including that I couldn't quite get to one or two of the guys involved, but then the 80s sort of from that peak of 84 it then became this slow and then quite rapid decline towards the end of the decade, and sort of that second half when it was a nosedive, wasn't it, into much different times. So no, I think it's a period we could maybe talk about and write about a bit more, because there's some real great players and characters, and Bob Stokoe coming back and people and things like that, and how the club, we're going to say evolved, but it went the wrong way, didn't it, in the end, and then needed another restart. But yeah, it was again, it was something I was conscious to include, but could always do more, I think, on that spell, because it seems a way off at the moment, that level of football, doesn't it? And yet there we were.
You do wonder if it's maybe something to do with the fact that football in the 1980s is almost seen as a little bit unfashionable, isn't it, with all the hooligan incidents and things like that, obviously, that people remember. That maybe where the slight sort of almost way people forget about it comes from. So yeah, we've talked about the fact that you went through and you picked your goals. Is there anything in particular that you wanted to include but weren't able maybe to get in contact with the player or something like that? Or is there any you feel particularly bad about leaving out?
There was one or two, yeah. I mean, we talk about the 80s and when you have these debates and forums online and on Twitter and things about, what goals and games do you remember? There's one or two that always come up, and one was against Newcastle in the early 80s, that festive game when Carlisle beat a star-studded Newcastle team 3-1. Tommy Craig scored this quite glorious chip, and I did try to reach Tommy Craig and couldn't quite get there in the time scale that I was working to on this book. So that was a shame. I think he did reappear a bit later on another podcast or something a while later. So maybe that's one I would go back to if I do a sequel or anything like that. So yeah, there was one or two I was quite sad that I couldn't include, because the goal scorers may have passed away or they may not have been in great health, and that's why I guess that also kind of underlines the fact that it isn't a chart, this book. It's not a top 40, because you quite simply have had to include Bill Green scoring at Chelsea, for example, and things like that. Poor Bill's no longer with us, and some of the dates like Stan Bowles, a phenomenal hat-trick against Norwich, for instance. A lot of people will have favourites like that just, obviously Stan's not in great health either. Those would have been, close to impossible to really do justice to from the perspective of the person. So, yeah, there's always going to be limitations with something like this, and I guess the other soul searching and tormenting I had with myself was on Peter Murphy, because Murphy scored two iconic goals. He scored a lot of great goals and great moments, but there can't be many players who've scored two separately but hugely iconic goals in that period of time, like Murphy did at Stoke and then and then at Wembley. And after a lot of soul searching, I went for Wembley because the story behind it was I felt just quite unique. And when speaking to Murph as well, he said, look, the feeling I had that day with that goal was like nothing I'd ever experienced. So I thought for him to say that, in light of him having scored one of the most important goals in the club's recent history at Stoke, was quite telling too. But I'm very conscious that that's a favourite for a lot of people, and if it was a book of important goals, that would be on the shortlist for sure.
Absolutely, it's quite strange. I have to say I've read the whole book, just to let you know. Because obviously I've made a joke in the past on Twitter about the fact that I never get around to reading your books. But I've read it literally, I think, a couple of weeks after I got it. I read it a little bit over one night, and then the second night, I think I was reading it till about 2 a.m. because I was just hooked with the stories I've not heard before. One thing that really strikes me about it is just how many of those players talk fondly about their time at the club, don't they? They seem to really have a close bond with the club, don't they?
They do. And I mean, I guess, I was talking to these guys about individual great moments or great days or significant days. So I think a lot of the fondness comes through those memories anyway. But you're dead right. That was the one thing that struck me, I think, more than any other theme, I think, that probably links most of these people, these 40 stories, these 40 personalities, was a real deep fondness for the club, even from guys who maybe weren't there that long, Magno Vieira, to pull one out at random, he was a young kid, he was on loan for not quite a full season, but the best part of one, never crossed paths with Carlisle again, but you could sense the warmth and the affection and the feeling and the regret that he never got the chance to relive a little bit of that again in his career. And I really enjoyed talking to David Reeves about not just the goal that sealed the title at Colchester in '95, but his whole story at Carlisle United. And one of the first things he said when we started talking was that I really want to get across the real appreciation I have for what the people of Carlisle and Cumbria, the supporters who followed us in that iconic season, what they did for me and my game, and how they backed me, and how they really sort of gave us this real rousing support. And it was quite emotional listening to some of that, because we're on the terraces or in the stands and we're watching these guys and they become your heroes. It's not as often you get to really get a feeling and a sense of what it means to these people too. And Carlisle stays with you, I think, as a player in quite a lot of cases. We've seen that over the years. Go back to Hughie McElmoyle. He came back to Carlisle and he found real comfort and a sense of home in coming back here in his later years. And people like Les O'Neill have moved back. You see it quite a lot. It's maybe something more of the past generations maybe of players, but you still get it from people like Reevesy who moved on and went to Bristol, and he said, I'm sure I didn't get the love from people when I went there, but still Carlisle that season was as good as anything I ever experienced, and it was special. So yeah, it was a real theme from beginning to end. It was lovely to hear, really, because it's nice to know the support that you give to these guys as fans is really felt.
Yeah. Is there any particular stories that came out of those players that you enjoyed listening to? I mean, I've picked up I'd enjoyed the story about I think it was Proudlock and Gates, wasn't it? With the was it the pigeons? I think it was. Some of Mountfield's tales as well, and I think it was Hegsy with his fishing as well. I never knew all about that. He seemed to really like the area too. He's a player who's only there for one season. It's incredible, isn't it?
Well, it is, and talk about Carl Heggs in 2001. Not just there for one season, but was there for one of the most sort of unsettling and turbulent seasons in the club's history. I mean, the place was an absolute nightmare, wasn't it then? You'll remember as well as I do, as a supporter, what the worries and fears that you had as fans about what was going to become of the club then. We had the Stephen Brown fiasco and the Mamcar, and the Nightingale was really going into a dark place. And yet Carl Heggs, 20 years on, just looked back so fondly about Carlisle, the place, and what went on, and that night at Lincoln when he scored that great volley and people were bursting onto the pitch and waving corner flags in the air, and it's remarkable how things like that stay with players. There were some great stories I loved hearing. I mean, you mentioned Paul Proudlock. I mean, he had a lot of fondness for Eric Gates. Actually, he did say that. I know he wasn't popular, and there was this perception of the fact that he maybe didn't pull his weight in the way people felt he should with the money he was on. He quite liked him, but he did tell a story about when they were training in the lakes and they were doing this cross-country run, and Proudlock said I was poor at long distances because my legs were so short, but I was in front of one man, and that was Eric Gates. So I thought, well, I'm not going to come last here. But then, lo and behold, a minute later, Clive Middlemas pulls up in his car, and Eric Gates is in the back seat, and Clive's saying, oh, he's too old for this. So, little tales like that. Because Proudlock's a great character. I'd never spoken to him before, but he was an absolute treat to speak to. He was one of my first heroes, really, watching. Other good little tales, they come from them all, really. I mean, go back to Magno Vieira. I chuckled when he was describing, when he was a young boy coming over from Brazil with this agent who was trying to sort of put him into English football, and he turned up at the airport with the equivalent of £10 in his pocket to buy some vitamin C, I think, or whatever it was, because he thought it was going to be so cold in England. There was no sun. So this kid leaves Brazil with £10 in his pocket, and then a few years later he's scoring one of the most bizarre goals for Carlisle that he ends up watching himself on a TV show about remarkable football goals. They're just sort of things that they're not everyday stories, are they? And that was quite a surreal one, talking to Magno, because my greenhouse was a bit of a sanctuary for me in the lockdown, and in furlough it was where I sat and sort of just talked to a lot of these players. And Magno's in New Zealand now, so I was sat in my greenhouse in the middle of the night, basically doing a WhatsApp call, talking to Magno about this quite bizarre goal, and it was quite surreal, really. I thought I was just losing my mind a little bit at that point, but a great guy to speak to, as most of them were. And I know another one you mentioned to me when we spoke the other day was Dave Symington, when he spoke about this quite astonishing free kick against Scunthorpe. I mean, surely one of the most remarkable free kicks Brunton Park has seen. And I was really interested talking to him about his route into the game as a young player, which wasn't the orthodox young lad who was obsessed with football and could name every player in the top flight. He came into Carlisle, and he freely said he was walking into the dressing room, and all the other young players were sort of in awe of Ian Hart being there, as you could imagine, this Champions League semi-finalist, this international star. And Dave Symington was turning to Brad Potts and saying, "What is he meant to be good like? I've never heard of him." But he was a young lad from West Cumbria who just liked playing football. I didn't watch football. I found it boring. I just wanted to go out and play. There was a bit of that in how he played, I think, for Carlisle when he came through, and that was just that sense of this lad who he'd shoot from anywhere without any reservation. And it was also interesting in how his life at the club kind of tailed off after that as well. You get an insight into psychology and the mental side of the game and how you deal with that. And that's all these stories flow from these goals and these moments a little bit. It was nice to sort of to unlock a little bit of that with some of them.
Yeah, I always feel with Symington, he's one of those lads who was maybe a little bit let down in the way he was treated at the club, in that he was sort of shipped into a right back position, wasn't he, for long periods, which I know he has played for Workington as well, but I think he's played more on the wing for them than as a defender. But I always felt that he's one of these players who clearly had ability, just maybe there was just not the patience to mould him into a decent player. But it happens, doesn't it, I suppose, with players like him occasionally, they just fade away from the top of the game. The other player I wanted to mention as well, I can't remember if I mentioned this when I was emailing you, was the Francois Zoko one. I absolutely loved hearing about that one, because I remember that goal myself, because I was working at the club there in the media team, and I remember doing you knew what Francois was like back then. He claimed he couldn't speak very good English, when I think he could speak slightly better than he was made out to put it bluntly. But he was a lovely fellow. But I remember we did, because was it a snowy night that night, or have I imagined that in my head?
I don't know if it was snowy, but it was freezing. Well, it was what it was time of year, wasn't it? It was quite a sort of a misty sort of night, but it was thick, as it always would be.
I just remember as well afterwards, he was just so cold when he was trying to do the post-match, and he would rather have been anywhere else, I think, that night. But yeah, the story about his mini, it's beautiful, isn't it? Because I remember when he came in, he was talking to Tony Bingley about the fact that he was desperate to get this mini, and I don't think Tony could understand. You could have any car you want. No, I want mini. I want a mini. He was obsessed with getting a mini, so it was like Mr. Bean flying around Carlisle.
Well, I remember that. It was quite a distinctive sight, Zoko coming into the car park in his Mini Cooper. But as he explained, and he told the London branch audience the other night when we did the launch for them why exactly that was, because I think he'd started off with a Range Rover, I think. he'd driven it with whoever it was in the passenger seat, who said, "Look, have you ever had driving lessons, Francois? You seem to be having a bit of a problem keeping this on the road." And I think he just sort of threw his hands up and said, "You know what? I need a smaller car that I can keep in the lanes here." So yeah, all part of the magic of Francois. But I mean, God, what a great goal that was! There was only Francois on the pitch that night that was going to produce that, and it was just absolutely beautifully executed. Overhead kick. He made it look easy, didn't he? But goodness me, what a moment!
And it was lovely to hear as well from him explaining why he actually came to the club too, because obviously he had that chance to go to, I think was it Charlton? I think it was the club that was after him, and he just thought, no, I want to be somewhere that's a bit smaller and a bit more quieter. And you don't always get that, do you? Because I've had a lot of players from abroad do tend to want to go to London because that's where quite often there's a lot of French or Spanish or whatever people live in. So yeah, it was just nice to hear from him. I think from the more recent ones, I did enjoy hearing about Danny Granger's goal. I was a little bit surprised you didn't pick the Portsmouth one though. I thought that might have been one because considering it was with his weaker foot as well.
Yeah.
Amazing that one.
That was another one of those dilemmas. I mean, I remember chatting to Danny and said, "Look, there's one or two. You didn't get many tap-ins, Danny. Which one are we going to choose here?" And I went for Newport, and yeah, you could easily pick Portsmouth, but when he started talking about Newport and the fact it was a last-minute winner as opposed to an equaliser maybe carries it a little bit. The fact that when he talked about how special it was when he did his big knee slide in front of the Pioneer stand and he saw his young son, he just caught his eye straight away. His young lad was just going daft in the stand doing this big dance and jig, and it was quite special really. That, and when Danny talked about when he used to be that fan, that young supporter, stood in the Warwick at watching Jimmy Glass and things like that. I just like the symmetry between the sort of the last minute winner, and in a way that come towards the end of Danny's time at Carlisle, and he'd been on this sort of journey at the club, which didn't start particularly well in that first season when he came in under Kavanagh and got quite a lot of stick and was part of that struggle, and as the local player bore some of the brunt of that too. But he really showed character and mettle and the sort of the essence of Danny as we came to know him, how he fought through that. And I just thought a last minute winner at the ground where you used to come as a boy with your little lad in the stand going nuts like you used to do yourself. I just thought it was just a nice package that it summed up where Danny had got to with the club. But yeah, Portsmouth was a ridiculous goal as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing that sort of stands out for me in some of these stories about the goals is the fragility of some of these players. You think of them as these heroes, don't you? These big, strong athletes on the pitch. But then you hear actually mentally, some of them find it tough. I mean, Warren Aspinall's an obvious one. Brilliant player on the pitch, but off the field clearly had his demons, didn't he? And that comes across in his tales. And I mean, even Chris Billy's quite self-deprecating, isn't he, of his ability as a footballer, but he was a brilliant player for us. And you sometimes wonder, when you see fans giving players his stick, it almost makes you think, maybe shouldn't ease off a little bit on them sometimes.
Yeah, there's always a person and there's always a story and a mindset behind all of these guys, and that was one of the many fascinating parts of being able to do this was hearing some of those aspects. I mean, you know Jeff Thorpe well as a Cockermouth boy. Yeah. I've spoken to Jeff before about life after football, so I had a sense of where his stories might go. But we talked about his incredible day at Scunthorpe, that brilliant 2 goals in that iconic season in the deck chair, and yet his perspective on football had gone through so many different phases through the career that was so unfortunately hindered by the injuries that he had, and how that affected his outlook and his mentality on the game. And then when he came out of football and was looking upon the game in a much different and probably darker light and quite a frustrated light, I think. And then how he kind of went off and did other things and learned a lot about himself and about life, and went into academia, and how he kind of rebuilt a different sort of perspective on the game. Now, I thought it was absolutely fascinating to talk to Jeff, a really sort of bright and thoughtful guy, about how a football life can go in so many different ways, just based on the misfortune of an injury, perhaps, or just what happens when you come out of it and how you come out of it. So that was one. We mentioned Dave Symington. He talked about how he really felt like he was just going into a brick wall at that time when he couldn't force his way back in under Curl. And Mally Poskett was another one who I thought was really honest. I'd never spoken to Mally before. I found him so disarmingly honest and sincere about how he found life after football and not being able to recreate that buzz of scoring goals, which is what he was all about, and how it really affected him and his life, and then how he struggled and found it quite hard, and still has a perspective on it now that I think is vastly different to those glory days. He said, I can't really watch football at Brunton Park now because you just want to be out there playing and you can't, and I find myself just kicking the seat in front of me in frustration. So it's, these are the insights I was really pleased I was able to get, because it's about so much more than scoring a goal and talking about what a great goal you scored. You want to know a bit about the person behind it, so they all had something different to tell, and that's the beauty of it, I suppose, really making it all about the stories and the people as much as the player, if you like.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent here. I'm going to tell you my favourite story about Jeff Thorpe, because it's a weird one, because it's basically about when my uncle used to take me to go and watch Carlisle games. My uncle, he sadly passed away 10 years ago this weekend, actually. So my Uncle James used to take me and my brothers to go and watch Carlisle in the 94-95 season, when things were really picking up and we were doing really well. And he'd take us to the Tuesday night games, I think, because my dad wasn't able to do it, probably to do with work, something like that. So we went through one week to a game, and it was a game, I can't remember what it was, it might have been one of the auto windscreens games, but it was a midweek game anyway, and we won it. But on the way back, when we got to Cockermouth, we stopped off to get some chips. For tea.
Doesn't sound like you, Lee, that.
No, not at all. Anyway, so pop into this chippy, and we're there, and I've got my Carlisle scarf on, my uncle's there, and there's a fella stood there also getting his chips, and he turns to my uncle and goes, "Oh, you been to the game tonight?" And my uncle's like, "Oh yeah, just been to the game, cracking result again, yeah, another great result." Or I tell you what, that Jeff Thorpe had a cracking game, but there was one point he was through in on goal. He was playing through a through ball, and he could have easily scored, but he turned back and passed the ball back to someone, and he really should have took the chance. It would have made it even more comfortable. Aye. And the uncle goes, "Did you go to the game as well?" And the guy goes, "Aye, I did. I'm Jeff Thorpe."
Brilliant. You just didn't recognise him. How on earth?
I know. My uncle normally, could have talked for England. Absolutely lost for words at that point, but bless him, Jeff said, "Don't worry about it. You're absolutely right. I should have gone through and scored there, shouldn't I?" But yeah, it always amuses me, that story. But yeah, so I think we sort of covered the main parts of the book here, John. So I've got a couple of questions here for you. I've given you these in advance so you can have a think about them. So firstly, what are the 3 best goals you've seen for United? So that's the 3 best in terms of quality.
Best in terms of quality. I mean, these are so hard to narrow down. I suppose ones I've seen. I'll go with my supporting and reporting period then, because I wouldn't be fair for me to say Huey Mack against Gator, because I never saw it. But in terms of remarkable, how on earth did he do that unique quality? I have to think of Pericard against Norwich. Yeah. Because I still can't figure out, watched that hundreds of times, I still can't quite figure out how he's done that. Because not just the technique of reaching behind himself in this sort of scorpion style, whatever he did, but how he got such power in the shot. He sent it rocketing past Fraser Forster, didn't he, that night in the mist. And I found it unfathomable. You couldn't try that in your garden at home, I don't think, and pull it off without.
Do you think the mist adds to
years of practice? Oh, definitely, yeah. It was so atmospheric. The photographs that Stuart Walker took for the News and Star that night, it's so atmospheric and so almost eerie. It was quite a heavy mist, wasn't it, at the time?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
and it was this early evening kick-off because it was being live streamed or something, and then out of the mist comes this incredible goal that I think people talk about forever as Carlisle supporters who were there or who saw that. So. Not orthodox technique. You talk about Zoko's overhead kick as really spectacular, but phenomenal technique. Pericard was something that you don't see. You maybe see once every decade or something. So that was pretty special. I want to say Michael Bridges against Chester too. Now Bridges again was a guy that didn't do tap-ins. I could have included his goal at Northampton. His lob, I think, against Grimsby, great goal. He scored against Lincoln on a bog of a pitch. But the Chester goal was his favourite, and it was mine as well. And I think it's partly because I remember what that pitch was like back then.
Wasn't it?
It was just before it was just before David Mitchell really
Was, yes.
got on the case of that, and it was redone that summer in '06 under Fred Story, etc. And it became a bit of a carpet after that. And since then, David Mitchell's just turned into one of the best pitches around. But then
John, that is the last time we had a game called off for a waterlogged pitch, bar the floods.
wow,
It was that season. Incredible. That.
amazing. Which is just testament to what's been done there, and the guy they've got looking after it. It was one of the club's greatest assets, I think, and always will be as long as he's there. But that pitch, going back to Bridges, knowing what that pitch was like, and I think that was in February against Chester. He glided across that pitch as though it was an ice rink. He was doing step overs. He was sending one Chester player one way down the M6, another one the other way, and it was just it was so superior quality that he was showing in that, the balance, the poise, that I can't really fathom how a player is able to dribble with that sort of elegance on a pitch that was clearly quite rutted and uneven and bobbly. I remember going on that pitch after the Stockport game when they came back and did the presentation. It was the first time I really got close to the pitch and realised how sort of heavy and bobbly it was. And there's Bridges that are gliding down it, going past 2 or 3, dropping the shoulder and pinging it in the bottom corner. And it was just, what is this guy doing here at this level of football? But he obviously came for good reasons, for his own sake and his own game, and he was really embraced, and he embraced Carlisle. But that was something on another level of quality that you normally saw in League Two football, I think. There are so many others. If you want me to do a top 3, I mean Zoko comes to mind. I'm thinking of some. I'm thinking of Simon Hackney screaming one through a crowd of players against Leeds. But I'm going to say Hallam Hope, because that goal against Notts County was one of those moments where, as a reporter, you don't tend to, you try and stop yourself getting too sort of emotionally embroiled in goals, even when it's your team that's scoring them. But that was just one of those moments where I just couldn't help standing up and just almost involuntarily applauding, because you could see what he was up to. I know a lot of people, and the Notts County side certainly didn't, least of all the goalkeeper, and it was the fact that he had the thought and the foresight and the nerve to try and pull that off, and then did it. Again, it was one of those goals you might see once every 10 or 15 years. It went absolutely viral, maybe more than any other Carlisle goal, I'm not sure. And I just wanted to applaud the ingenuity of that. I know it was a horrible night against Notts County. It was a storm raging. The performance was poor. The team was coming down the wrong side of that promotion push under Presley after losing the loan players, etc. And yet, even on a grim night like that, you see this little bit of magic. That's something that takes a bit of nerve and imagination and ingenuity to do. And it was a horrible 3-1 defeat, and it counted for more or less nothing. But I just wanted to applaud that, and that's what you don't see all the time. So I'll go with that one if we're going for a top 3. But ask me again tomorrow, I'll probably pick a different 3. That's how it goes, isn't it?
Well, off the top of my head, my 3 best goals, I say, not necessarily my favourites, I'd probably say Granger's goal against Portsmouth that we mentioned earlier, just for the fact that he was with his swinger and it was just ridiculous. Lee Madison, the one goal he scored for us against Leyton Orient, and I remember, because I was stood in the paddock and I was right behind them when he hit it. I've never seen a ball move like that into the top corner. Incredible goal.
Yeah, that was on my shortlist. That was close to making it in, but maybe in the next one. And yeah, fantastic goal. Oh, incredible.
And then I struggled to pick between these two. One of them came up to my head the other day, and I'd forgotten about this goal for years. The part of me is thinking I've imagined it because I can't find any footage of it. Stuart Green, I'm sure, scored a goal against Torquay, again on a pudding of a pitch, where I think he went through on goal, beat a defender, rounded the keeper and put it into the empty net. And we talk about how bad the pitch was when Bridges was playing that day, but I'm sure this night the game was barely played. I think it was just about going to be called off, but they went ahead of it. It's either that or it's got to be Dobie's goal against Chester, again, just for the ridiculousness of it.
The emotion that unleashed, and Scott talked about that himself, people bursting from behind that goal. It was a huge following there at Chester. It was one of those periods where Carlisle were in crisis, weren't they, for a period of seasons. It was relegation battle after relegation battle, and it was also the club's very future, I think, on the line as well, and how things were starting to go under Knighton. And it was just one of those moments that, down to 9 men, terrible game. I don't think they had a shot on target. I don't think they had 90 odd minutes, and Dilby lashes one in. It's just, I remember listening to that. I wasn't there at that game, but I remember listening to Derek Lacey on the radio, and it was just that thought of, how on earth do we keep doing this? How do we keep pulling these ridiculous moments out of the bag when all seems lost? Just incredible. We go back to puddings of pitches briefly as well. I'm thinking back to the mid-90s when Wadsworth's team were on the march, and that auto windscreens running, well, probably, the both runs that they had, 94 and then 95, but that Rochdale game, the first leg of that set.
You can say David Curry.
David Curry swinging one in that wind-assisted beauty,
Yeah.
but also the pitch, if you look at the pitch and the weather, it's terrible, and yet Rod Thomas was doing step-overs and jinking into the box. Curry was working his magic, and, could you imagine that quality of surface now at this level of football? You can't. It just shows the progress, doesn't it? But what good stuff Carlisle played then just shows the quality of those guys, doesn't it?
Yeah. Newport accepted in terms of pitches of that quality, I think, at the moment. But,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, the next one I had for you, it's whether they're different to the three best ones. Your three favourite goals, would you say, that from the last 30 years?
Yeah, I think it is a different question, because I think they can be goals that stay with you for all sorts of different reasons. So I jotted about half a dozen down. I was having a battle getting it down to 3, but I think up there with probably my favourite goal I've ever seen at Carlisle was Joe Joyce against Huddersfield in 94. And I think that just takes me back to that place on the paddock where the ground's, not full, but there's 8,000 odd in there, and it's a point when Carlisle are on the rise. It's a point where I was at an age, I was 13, I think then, when you're really starting to, I guess, get that connection maybe more with your club than when you're a bit younger and smaller. You're understanding a little bit more about the game, and all these things were coming together, and then Carlisle were coming back from the dead in this tie, had scored a goal, and then little more than a minute later, the right back, who isn't known too often for crossing the halfway line, pops up and not just scores, but hits the sweetest goal you'll ever see. It rocketed into the net, and I just remember what that felt like in that crowd that night. It was just one of those moments where you lose your mind and your senses a little bit. The place went nuts. People were hugging each other, going absolutely ballistic. And that's still quite a vivid feeling and memory for me. So, and I think a lot of other people have sort of treasure that moment too. And it had that element of just being a sort of agonising failure that night, didn't it too? Because when Joyce stuck that one in, you think, well, this is on. This comeback is on. We're going to get to Wembley here. And then it was just that agony of not quite being able to follow it up in the second half, etc. So that was always a real favourite. Another goal that meant a lot to me was Murphy at Wembley, that winner. That was from a professional point of view, being able to sit in the press box at Wembley and report on my team winning a cup final was a real privilege and sort of an ambition as long as I've been in this sort of job, to do that. And it had the added factor of the fact that it was such a great servant and great player and great person scoring. It was such a good goal. The technique to do what he did, and everything around that weekend of Murph becoming a dad, putting to rest the demons of the year before with handball and everything Murph had been through on that journey at Carlisle. That's something I'll always really treasure, that I was able to sit there and write about that and report on it and be there and witness it. So that'll always be a favourite. And trying to pick a third is really hard. One of my favourites, and it might not be in many other people's top 3s or 5s, was Paul Murray against Doncaster at the start of the 06-07 season. Now, again, wasn't a spectacular goal. In the end, it didn't count for a huge amount team-wise in the long run, but I'd got to know Paul Murray over the preceding months, just through the job when he'd come back to Carlisle to get fit again, and then he signed, and then he had the big sort of red tape issue in getting him, his eligibility to play for Port Bugle, and I'd become quite close to Muzzer in that respect as a reporter. But I was still a fan. I was still much more of a fan than a reporter. I'd been doing the job for a few months. Muzzer was one of the young players in the 90s who I absolutely loved to watch. I thought it was absolutely fantastic the way he played, the way he went about it. Real shame what injuries stopped him going on to achieve, I think. And then he that injury he had when he came back in '06 was career threatening. He was very close to finishing him. So I'd heard all of this from him. He'd spoken about all of this. I was a little bit awestruck, to be honest, when I was interviewing him at this time. And then when he stuck that goal in, which turned out to be the only goal he ever scored at Brunton Park, I just got so caught up in the feeling of that and the emotion of that. I was stood on my feet in the press box just cheering and howling. It was utterly embarrassing, making a complete show of myself, I think. but again, it's that memory of how these things make you feel, which I think is what all these goals and all these memories are all about. It's not just about what they maybe count for football wise. It's the emotions that they put into you, and that's how you remember them, and that's why they stick with you. I've got a few more on my list here. Simon Hackney against Leeds, the noise when that went in at Brunton Park, that 3-1. I think that's the loudest I've ever heard Brunton Park in all my time going there. It was a full house, and putting Leeds to the sword doesn't get much better than that, does it? So yeah, loads of other favourites, but things like that stick out. Carl Hawley at Mansfield, that capping that season, and that goal scoring season he had. That was my first season as a reporter as well. Just magical stuff. So everyone has the favourites. That's the joy of it, isn't it? For different reasons.
Absolutely. Some really good ones in there, John. Actually, somebody might have forgotten about. I mean, I remember that Murray goal as well. I remember the fact that that's one of our biggest opening day crowds at home ever, isn't it? That game against Doncaster, and people forget that. I think there was something like 11,000 there that day. Maybe I think it was.
Yeah, it was. Exactly. You had fans behind the waterworks as well. The fans as well, didn't you? Which always makes it a better sense of occasion when there's a decent crowd in there. And we'd come up 2 divisions. We're really on the march, weren't we? I know Simo had gone by then, but there was a sense of the club going places, and this local hero had been through the mill and had come back scoring. It was a bit of romance in that, I think, as well. And I was really chuffed for Muzzer, and he treasures that as well. And it was nice speaking to him about it. But yeah, it was good senses of occasion at Brunton Park. It's amazing how many memorable moments really come from those days. You don't forget them in a hurry, do you?
Well, I'm going to pick my 3 favourites now, right? I've just thought these off the top of my head because I'd forgotten to write them down earlier. So the first 2 of them you probably expect. One of them, the middle one, you might be a bit surprised by. But anyway, Paul Conway v Bury in that game on, not on Boxing Day, sorry, I always say this, but on the 27th. It still amazes me that we played on Boxing Day, won 5-0, and then played the day after and won 3-0 against second place Bury. Blows my mind that. You think these days clubs complain about too many games and stuff, don't they? And they played 2 in the space of 24 hours. But that Conway goal, you'd maybe pick the Curry goal in that game. I know you've had that as your banner, haven't you, on Twitter a few times in the past. Yeah. But the Conway goal sticks out for me because this is the first ever game I went to, Carlisle game.
Right, wow.
Of all the first games to go to, I know. I've been cursed for life ever since. It's brilliant, isn't it? But the Curry goal was at the far end, and I was in the paddock near where the gates are at the top end. And we were sat on the wall at the front, so I couldn't really see the Curry goal as clearly. I would have been 10 years old? No, maybe 9 years old actually then, just coming up to 10. But the Conway goal was scored at the end we were sat at, and I just remember the noise when that goal went in, and the feeling of wow, this is what it's like to go to an actual football game. And like I said, it got me hooked for life, and that's why it's a special goal for me. The second one is Richie Foran's equaliser against Halifax in Roddy Collins' first season in charge. Because it's kind of weird one because it kept us in the league, but it kept us in the league with about 7 games to go, so it doesn't really matter that much. Everyone forgets the fact that it wasn't like it was with a couple of games to go. There was about 7 or 8 games still to go at that point. But it was amazing that Collins had turned around what looked an absolute mess at Christmas and went on this brilliant run of form that people do tend to forget about. But that game, that was real success in that period, wasn't it? Finishing
about 17th and staying up with time to spare. It was almost unheard of in that 4 or 5 year period, wasn't it?
And I just remember that night as well. That was the night when it'd been a few weeks, I think, or a month or 2 after Jon Colman had started to show his interest in buying the club, hadn't he? God rest his soul. And I remember, I think he was doing co-coms with Derek that night, wasn't he? Which is
that was still lively then.
Exactly that. But obviously, I think they got a goal quite late on to make it 2-1, and then I think in about the 4th minute in due time, Richie scored. It was almost a slide tackle into the bottom corner, into the goal behind which we were all stood in the big open banks of terracing at the Shea. And there must have been about 1,500 Carlisle fans. And I had 2 of my mates there who aren't particularly big Carlisle fans. And they said they've never seen anything like it, because as soon as the goal went in, there was a guy stood at the front trying to stop people going through this gate. This one steward trying to stop people from going through this gate. And the next thing you knew, Tony Hopper pushed past him to go into the stand, and the guy was like, why am I'm not getting paid enough to stop this. So basically the pitch was engulfed with fans by that point. And then I remember at the end that when the players came over celebrating, there was another mini pitch invasion, and Jon Colman was down there celebrating. And the excitement of thinking maybe finally something's going to happen. And obviously it did in the end, but it didn't happen straight away, did it? There was still a few months of turmoil after that as well. So I just remember that goal that night, and just the feeling when that goal went in. Just unbelievable. I mean, I could have picked any of the other goals in similar sort of circumstances, but that one's always a little bit different. And I always remember that because I would have been around about 17 then, and although not legally, I was able to go into the pubs and have a drink. So it felt a bit different going to the football then by that point. And the third one's one that's one of the ones in your book. It's Lee Miller's goal against Huddersfield.
Oh, yeah.
And again, you mentioned they're losing it a bit when Paul Murray scored his goal against Doncaster. But I remember just losing my head when this goal went in. And bear in mind, I was working in the media team, not even in the press at that point. And because there was a guy from The Guardian there, wasn't there, doing almost like a sort of colour sort of article piece on it. And I remember him just being blown away at how good a football we were playing at that point. Against a Huddersfield team. Against a Huddersfield team that cost so much more to put together than ours did. And that goal, again, it's not a great goal. It's one of the scruffiest goals you'd imagine. I mean, Danny Livesey might disagree with me with his brilliant through ball, but it was just the feeling, and that the place erupted. And it wasn't, it was about a crowd of about 8,000, I think, that day. Yeah, but it felt bigger, and it just felt like this team is going to go into the playoffs at the very least here. And then, as Lee mentioned, sadly got the injury. He never really regained the same form, did he? After that, I don't think.
No, he didn't. I mean, I think the following season when he came back, he did chip in a reasonable amount of goals, but the team was obviously in decline then, and it was only heading one way, and his Carlisle career was never quite the same, and it sort of quite sadly faded out after that. But that day against Huddersfield, and I've written this in the book, and as I know a number of other fans have said this too, it was really, I mean, we're going back 8 years now, which is frightening, but was that the last time that Brunton Park really felt like it did that day? The place was shaking when that goal went in, and people were just going absolutely nuts. People were tumbling down the Warwick Road, and some people were falling over. It was just that, again, that moment where you lose your senses a little bit. And as the place felt quite like that ever since, I don't know. I
can only think of maybe 2 games or 2 goals moments that get close to that, and would be, I think, was it Exeter 3-2? I think White scored a last minute winner in that game. I remember going quite mad then when we were sort of pushing for promotion under Curl. But also when Miller scored his goal, Sean Miller, that is, had that many of them, haven't we? Against Exeter, that header, I think, the only other time. But I'd agree with you, I don't think they ever felt quite like that Miller goal, because we really were flying at that point. Whereas when Miller scored his goal against Exeter, we had a bit of sort of barren run, hadn't we, prior to that, I think. And the Exeter one, there still was that feeling of distrust, maybe, I think, towards the board and that kind of thing. So yeah, that Miller goal, and like I said, Lee never really hit the heights quite the same after that, did he? And I think he probably wasn't helped as well. People forget he got a bad ankle injury as well at the start of the next season, didn't he?
He did,
a horrendous tackle on him that wasn't punished. So it's one of those ones, a little bit of regret there. Maybe we never quite saw all of the best of Lee Miller, but for the 8 or 9 months we had him at his best, he was incredible, wasn't he?
It was the absolute key to that team, turning from a team that certainly had bits of promise and had some. It had a bit of a blend actually, but he brought the whole thing together, didn't he? And when Abbott found that blend of Loy and McGovern, and then Zoko came in after Loy's injury, it seemed to have all the pieces were there. And Lee says himself, I just thought we had the package there. And when Jordan Cook came in, didn't he too, in that period, and he got a couple of goals, and it just seemed like it was happening. But then in classic Carlisle fashion, something comes out of nowhere and sabotages it, and it's just never quite as simple as you want it to be. But that season, from his debut actually at Orient onwards until the moment he limped off against Scunthorpe, so influential, and I don't think people should underestimate just how good he was in that period. Absolutely.
Just a couple of quick more questions for you, John. I'll let you get on with the rest of your day and prepare for the big game at Grimsby tomorrow. So I think you've sort of briefly covered this, but what inspired your decision to sort of support the NHS through the sales of the book?
Well, that was quite an easy decision to do that, because it was, as I said, the idea came from the lockdown when COVID was at its climbing to that horrible peak in the March-April period, and I just thought, in all good conscience, could I have done anything other than give the small amount of money that this idea in this book might potentially raise? Could I give it anywhere other than the local NHS in Cumbria that were going above and beyond and still are doing to help people, to save people's lives, to make people's lives easier in this utterly bizarre and weird and extremely serious and troubling year that we're all having. So I just thought it was the right thing to do and the proper thing to do, and I just hope that it encourages people to, if they haven't any other reason to buy the book, that might be one that they say, well, it's a little contribution from each copy goes there. So I just felt it was right. Most of us use the NHS at some point in our lives, don't we? And I have, my family has in the fairly recent past, and I think a bit of appreciation to them. I know a lot of people say the NHS isn't a charity and we shouldn't treat it as such, and I completely agree with that. But I still think that shouldn't stop us wanting to give it a little help if we want to and if we feel like it's right. So it was as simple as that, mate, really, and I'm glad that that's where it's going.
Excellent. So another brief one. I didn't actually send this one to you beforehand, but it's just something that's come into my head, sort of. What's it been like over the last few months, in particular, reporting on the club during these really strange times and going to these games where there's no fans? That Southend game must look like such an anomaly now, really, in the grand scheme of things.
It was so refreshing, that Southend game, honestly. Look, myself, the other reporters, Radio Cumbria, club media people, we're the lucky ones, and we shouldn't forget that. We're allowed to go to these games. It's very well controlled and organised in how we're able to go and do our jobs and cover these games and report on them for people. But it really isn't the same. So Southend in with 1,000 people there, it felt more normal. It felt like a football game should. There was some atmosphere. There were some of the usual noises and cheers and groans and everything that gives a football game its life at this level. Covering the others, yes, you do get absorbed into the game as you always would, but you're always conscious that it's a bit strange and it's not quite right, and you're not getting that interaction from supporters that makes a game what it is. And I just felt at Port Vale the other week when we had that 3 or 4 minute spell that was so decisive, when I had the penalty save, I had Mellish lunging in to make that incredible challenge. 2 or 3 minutes later, he's up the other end of the pitch, popping one in front of what would have been a pretty busy away end, I think. And it just made me think just how much the Carlisle's faithful that travel up and down the land would have loved that moment, that few minutes. They would have been absolutely bouncing and jubilant. And until we get that back, it's not going to be the same. And it doesn't change how you do the nuts and bolts of the reporting job. But I think it does change how you see the game and I think it should change how you report the game, because such a big element of football isn't there, and what the crowd does and how players maybe interact with the crowd, what the paddock is saying, all these things. People gathering outside the ground, every part of that whole sort of life force of a football game isn't there, and I think it would be wrong not to acknowledge that and to really miss it, because you feel like you're reporting on a reserve game in a lot of ways when there's nobody there, and you hear all the shouts. That's quite interesting. You can hear what Beach is shouting. You can hear Paul Farman in another county, I think. He's got the loudest voice going. But it's interesting to hear some of that you don't normally pick up on. But it's you'd happily lose that in the click of a finger to get supporters back. I really hope it can happen soon, because the game won't be the same until it is, and the game will struggle until that happens as well.
Yeah, you'd much rather have it hearing someone shout, "For God's sake, Anderson, sort it out," rather than a fireman bellowing out instructions, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would. You would. You just want to hear. Well, you want to hear the paddock giving absolute hell to to opponents and managers and referees and stuff. That's when we'll know we're over the worst of this. When the paddock is back in full cry and causing misery to people. So
that's the thing I miss the most, definitely.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's the one thing I've missed ever since the press box moved from that side of the ground to the Pioneer stand. In every other way, it's far superior now because the facilities are great. The club have done a great job in how they've kitted that out. It's perfect, but you just don't you don't get the paddock down in front of you or the people in that main stand, saying what they say to the directors and those interactions too. But you can still pick up on it from a distance, and it's what makes Brunton Park what it is when it's when it's got a decent number of people in and there's a good game going on. There's a bit of edge. There's been a bit of controversy, and that's when it can come into its own. We can all remember games when it's been like that more than others. And yeah, fingers crossed it can happen again soon, and the place will be a bit as it should be again.
Finally, John, what's the next book going to be then?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, we've talked about all the ones I've left out of this book, so I might have to do a number two, a sequel of Bolts from the Blues. I could easily draw a list of 2 or 3 more. So, in all seriousness, that would be a possibility, maybe, if time allows. I mean, I was lucky in a way that I had all the time to be able to do this and not fit it around the day job, which does make it more challenging. So maybe one day I'll look to do that. I've got some other ideas of maybe bits of ghostwriting or some other themes, but I think after you've done a book, you pour so much of your life and soul into it, you do need a break from it because it takes over your mind and it takes over your life. You need to give a bit of that time to your family and stuff as well. So yeah, I hope and think it won't be the last book I'll do. See what the next 2 or 3 years bring, maybe. And I'm always up for ideas and thoughts. It's just sometimes the challenge is physically putting them into practice, but it's we'll see. Watch this space. It'd be nice to do something else in the not too distant. Well,
thanks, John, for your time. Anyone out there who's interested in the book, they can get it from the Blue Store. I think quite a few shops in Carlisle as well as selling it.
Yeah, the Blue Store have been great. They've really got behind it, the club, and there's the signed copies in there. It's in Bookends in Carlisle. It's in HMV. Waterstones have got a big batch in there now, and most of these places they'll do online orders as well. That the publishers' vertical editions, it can be ordered directly from their website, Amazon, you name it. So all these places, and if anyone's ever having any difficulty getting hold of one, they can get in touch with me on Twitter or via the paper, and we can help there. So hopefully people who want it can get their hands on it and enjoy it and know that it's going to a good little cause as well.
I presume it's discounted if you've signed it then.
Yeah, the unsigned ones definitely got more resale value. Definitely, yeah. You won't see those on eBay, but the signed ones you will.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. I would 100% recommend the book to anyone. It's a perfect Christmas present. I'll be buying one for all my family. John, hopefully we'll catch up with you again soon to discuss all things Carlisle United and hopefully talking about a promotion push because it looks like it's on, doesn't it?
Ooh, steady on. Yeah, it's, well, look, I think after them first 2 or 3 games, we'd all have taken sitting 5th as we're speaking after 7 games with 3 wins out of 4 and playing some decent stuff in the last few weeks. Really, you can see the effects of what Beach is trying to get out of the team, and I hope it can be sustained. I hope injuries allow and get some of those injured players back and. You see a bit of evidence of things knitting together, and it would be great, wouldn't it, to have a season where there's the prospect of that. Although I know this is going to be a season like no other. In a way, you're just glad that we're able to watch the team. Yeah. I know it's I follow for most people, but just that it's happening at all. But wouldn't it be great if this new rebuilt team with all the big changes can become a bit of a unit that cracks on and generates a bit of positivity, and that's what we can report and enjoy somehow. So yeah, it is early days. I wouldn't like to throw my hat on a promotion challenge at the moment, but some good signs we've seen. That there's definitely evidence of some good progress, and I think that there's a squad of good characters too. That's what I've noticed.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Interviewing them and seeing how they generally go about the work and things like that. It's hard to spot a bad egg amongst them, which we haven't always necessarily been able to say about certain squads in the past. These lot seem good guys, and I hope that counts for something. And you know, you like to see good people succeed, don't you? So let's hope we say that. I was just thinking as well. Just going back to the goals briefly. Yeah. We've talked here for the best part of an hour or more. Mm-hmm. We've not mentioned the guy in the red jersey in '99 against Plymouth, have we? How have we managed to do that?
Do you know what? It's one of these things. I'm trying not to mention Jamie Devitt on the Mode podcast now, because we used to mention him every week for a bit. I've tried my hardest not to mention Jimmy Glass in this one, and you've managed to get us to the end, and I have. Sometimes you just try to, look at something a little bit different. It's like we mentioned about the fact that covering the 1980s stuff, so much is talked about the Glass goal, and quite rightly so. It's an incredible moment in history, but sometimes you need to give a bit more focus to the other parts of Carlisle United, I think.
Yeah, you do. You know what? It was bizarrely a little dilemma I had when I was doing the book as well. I was doing my short list, and obviously that was clearly on it near the top. But I did think, is there any way I can do a chapter on Jimmy Glass and say anything that hasn't already been said? Can we tell this story another way? And do I even think about leaving it out and doing another one? Maybe doing Brightwell's that day, or just looking for something else. But my wife just looked at me and said, "You're actually going to do a book about iconic Carlisle United goals?"
Leave it
My
out.
wife's not a football fan, but she knows of Jimmy Glass, and said, "You're not going to include Jimmy Glass. Are you being serious here?" And then, as ever, I agree with my wife. Realised I was being totally stupid, and rang Jimmy Glass, and I'm glad I did, because Jimmy's a really thoughtful guy and has given a perspective on everything that I don't know, maybe hadn't before in the same way. So yeah, you can't avoid Jimmy Glass, and you shouldn't. But you're right. There's a lot of other great moments that sort of sit in its shadow a little bit. So it's nice to bring those out too.
Definitely. Cheers, John. Thanks very much for your time, and up the Blues.
Pleasure, Lee. Thanks for having me.